Decoupling Your Design System. I think I have the session title that is the highest percentage of buzzwords. There's only one word that isn't. Next time maybe I'll go for 100%. But so yeah, psyched to be back at Decoupled Days. Really interesting stuff this year, and always love being back in New York City. Having a good time. So I'm Brian Perry. I am a lead front-end developer at a company called Bounteous. I live out in the Chicago suburbs, but grew up on the East Coast. Grew up in Rhode Island. Went to school in upstate New York. I went to Marist and Poughkeepsie. So love being back in New York City. I'm a lover of all things components and component-driven, so building with components in Drupal, design systems, and tools like Pattern Lab, and that obviously has a lot to do with what we're going to talk about today. Also increasingly interested in building with component-based JavaScript frameworks like React. Also a lover of all things Nintendo. That's a picture of me yesterday at the Nintendo New York store with my good friend Link. So happy to talk about all the cool games that you guys are playing on your Switches if you have a Switch. Right now for me it's Mario Maker and this game Gato Roboto, which is like Metroid if Samus was a cat. It's pretty cool. Also increasingly interested in the gem stack and alternatives to the large lamp stack that us Drupal folks have been using all these years. Available on the internet in a bunch of places, and would love to internet with you. So as I mentioned, I work at a company called Bounteous. Much thanks to Bounteous for sending me out here. Drupal is one of a handful of things that we do. I'm within our Drupal practice, do focus on Drupal in my day-to-day, but do a bunch of different things, but get to work with a great Drupal team, learn from them, and we're also currently hiring. So if you're looking for a new gig, definitely get in touch and let's talk. If you know me or have seen me speak before, you may not know me as being from Bounteous. You may know me from HS2 Solutions, or maybe you don't know me at all. That's totally fine. But I didn't quit. HS2 Solutions, through a period of growth, we rebranded. And that's part of what we're going to be talking about today, kind of a jumping off point into some of this. So we're going to talk about using design systems as an external dependency to projects in a couple of different contexts. The first is going to be a more traditional CMS architecture, so I'll be the guy who talks about a traditional CMS here. And then after that, we'll talk about it in the context of a progressively decoupled project as well. But first, we're going to start with this rebranding story, and how we used a external design system in that. So this is our screenshot of our old HS2 Solutions site, and we had a new design of our Bounteous site. So it was a website rebuild process. We had a brand launch targeted for November 5th, 2018, but it was part of a larger process, although it didn't actually feel like that for me day to day. But there's things like press releases and notifying our client base, infrastructure stuff, changing email addresses, new business cards, all of that stuff. And the website was just a part of it. And we were migrating from a number of older sites. So we had our HS2 Solutions site in Drupal 7. Also, part of our rebranding was growth through acquisitions. So we had the LUNAMETRICS site was on WordPress, so was Infield Digital. And specifically, we wanted to take the blog content and have that live on in our new Drupal 8 site. Especially LUNAMETRICS had a great host of historical blog content. Some of the other content, since we were rebranding, we were kind of starting clean with. So a lot of the migration efforts were around that blog content. But Nate was leading the charge there and working on the migrations and starting to get some data to land in Drupal 8. And then at the same time, Leon on the XD team was doing initial concepts for our new site, working in Sketch, sharing things in InVision, and I was following along in Pattern Lab, prototyping things, trying to get things so we could look at them in code, test at various different non-standard breakpoints, that sort of stuff, and just play along at home. And then the prototypes evolved, and we did higher fidelity prototypes. Jolene was leading the charge there. And again, I just continued prototyping in this pattern lab instance so we could see more in code and really get our hands on it. So that brought us to the point where now we've got a good set of prototypes that everybody's behind. We've got data that's starting to land into our new Drupal 8 instance. And we need to think about how we're going to integrate this into our Drupal build. Or for the ridiculous example, I'm going to use where we want to put the mustard. So we've got these two different cases here. Mustard mayonnaise, so a jar that has both mustard and mayonnaise all mixed in. And if you may get the reference, and if you do, bonus comedy points for that. Or a separate container of mustard and mayonnaise. So the mustard mayonnaise approach is kind of in line with what I had been doing in the past, and is pretty common in Drupal component builds, where a pattern lab instance is embedded inside of a theme, pretty tightly coupled there. So there's advantages and disadvantages to this approach. It's potentially easier for Drupal to get access to the components. In this case, it's just in the theme directory right there. In some ways can simplify the build process. And for people who might be new to this component-based approach, it's a little bit easier for them to wrap their heads around in that they look in the theme, and they see the theme things, they're there, they can touch them, change them, all that good stuff. It's also going to be often prone to Drupal-specific things finding their way into the components, which, depending on what you're building, may or may not be a good thing. And then on the other hand, there's the approach of having independent projects and the design system be an external dependency, which is kind of where we were at this point in time in this project. So we had a Drupal repository. We had a repository for the design system. In theory, that will promote reuse beyond just one single Drupal project. So we had to figure out which approach made sense for us in this project. And in this case, we decided to keep the mustard separate. We were not going to have the Heinz mayo must, which is in fact a real thing that I recently saw in a supermarket. It's not every day during a talk I can say something I recently saw in a supermarket. But it keeps, so as I mentioned before, it can keep the components Drupal agnostic. Some other reasons behind taking this approach. I think it helps encourage prototyping. When things are embedded in a Drupal theme, it's more common for people to stand things up in Drupal and start theming there. And with it as a separate, isolated project, it's a little bit easier to do that more lightweight prototyping. And it already was a separate project, so it's kind of our starting point. And then also there were some gut feelings that went into this decision. So it's always conceptually felt like the right thing to me, even if it wasn't what I did. It was advocated by many in the community whose opinions I trust, which is always a good thing. And there was the suspicion, although no real hard requirements at this point, that we might be able to use these components and use this design system for other web projects that are related to our brand. And then also, it kind of felt right for our company. So these are not all developers at Bounteous, not all front-end developers. I'd imagine there are people here in this GIF that don't even work here anymore. But we do have quite a bit of front-end developers, and not all of them are Drupal people. Many of them don't have experience with Drupal at all or don't care about Drupal at all. So having this, the design system separate, I think puts us in a position where more people in our company, more front-enders, can contribute to our company site, which sounds like a great thing. So let's talk a little bit about specifically how we handle this. So we're using the PHP version of Pattern Lab. So the design system is a composer dependency in this case. So in the design system, just a simple composer.json file gives it a name, a description, and then we define a type of design system in this case. We'll see how that's used in just a second. And then in the Drupal project, we need to reference the design system repository, so we can include it as a dependency. So we've got our Bitbucket URL there. And then in the extra section, we define an installer type of design system, and that was what we specified in the design system composer file. And then in installer paths, we just say when there's a dependency of type design system, which is a type that we just made up, it's going to go to this location, similar to what happens for core and contrib modules and all that stuff here. So Went back and forth on where it really should live, but in this case, it's in a libraries directory in our theme, which hopefully indicates that this is a dependency that should be hands-off. Looked at some other possibilities there. I didn't want to have a separate composer dependencies for the theme. And in having it in the overall project's composer dependencies, there were some issues I ran into trying to reach all the way from the theme deep into the vendor directory. So that's how we landed here. And then, so now we can require the design system via composer. And for the pre-launch cycle, we just required at dev, because we were kind of moving fast, making a lot of changes. This also lets us update, so bring in the latest version of the design system as the Drupal project wants it. And we can tag releases in the design system, so we can require a specific release, roll back to a certain release of the design system. But as I mentioned, kind of leading up to launch, we were mostly just at dev. And then, so now that we have this dependency in our project, let's talk about how it's incorporated into the theme. For those who are familiar with component-based theming in Drupal, there's probably nothing really new or exciting here, but we have a global library that we defined that has our compiled assets. So there's the compiled CSS file, our JavaScript bundles, so that gets loaded globally with the theme. And then we define some Twig namespaces using the component module. So this lets the theme see these templates outside of a place, outside of the standard template directory, and also gives us the little @Twig namespace shortcut, so we can write cleaner things when we reference and extend templates. Not exactly following the kind of standard levels of the atomic design naming conventions, but in the neighborhood there. So now at this point, we've got the design system in as a dependency. It's part of our theme. So we can talk a little bit about some kind of workflows the team fell into with it. So we've got Sean available and working on the project. And Sean can do Drupal things, but I'd say he is his truest self when he's just writing really good HTML, CSS, and JavaScript that's CMS agnostic. So this sets him up so he can do that. He did the bulk of the remaining design system components outside of Drupal. So he only had 2 commits in the Drupal repository, but without him, we really wouldn't have had a theme. And Wade was the guy who was kind of the middleman, integrating these components into Drupal as they became available. So he was wiring the design system components to content, including them in layouts and layout builder. And most of his work was in the Drupal repository, but when there were cases where maybe there was something that Drupal needs that wasn't considered in the initial component, or just in general when he could make his life a little bit easier, he did do some refactoring in the design system. So as is often the case in the projects that we do, there were scope surprises. That in this case, really having this external design system opened up some interesting possibilities. So the LUNAMETRICS site, one thing that LUNAMETRICS did, and now as Bounteous does, is they offer trainings throughout North America for things like Google Analytics and Google Tag Manager. So they had a training site that lists out the upcoming trainings and also allows you to register for training classes. And we determined we weren't going to be able to fit rebuilding this into our initial timeline, especially because there was some new functionality that had just been added. So we decided we were going to try to keep the WordPress sites alive in its current location, but just give the new look and feel of the Bounteous sites. And I think that's something we really wouldn't have been able to consider, or at least would not have been top of mind, if we didn't have this, this separate design system dependency. So to actually handle the integration, we worked with a company called Walia Creative, who did the initial theming of the LUNAMETRICS site. And they happened to be available, which was great, because they already knew the theme, and we needed some extra hands. And they introduced, at least me, to the Timber plugin, which I'd never used before. And so Timber allows you to use Twig in WordPress. I love their slogan here, because WordPress is awesome, but the loop isn't, which I personally agree with. So they created a initial prototype using the components from the design system and Timber to stand things up pretty quickly and prove that we could create something in WordPress that still really closely matches the look and feel of the rest of the Drupal site. So here's just a quick example of what that looks like. So there's on the training landing page, there's a list of upcoming trainings. So we've got these training item rows here. And then in training module.php, we've just got a wrapping div, and then a for loop that just takes, in this case, course data and assembles it into a training element, just an array of the data that we need to pass into the component. Not all that far off from something like a Drupal render array here. And then in the training element.php template, really all we're doing is we're saying Timber render, then the template that we want to use to render it, and just passing the data into it that we want. So we actually get to use that component as it stands. So it's nice and clean. And then that is going to give us the individual upcoming training rows that we expect. So that did allow us to take the WordPress sites and really make it match closely to the new look and feel. And we even stealthily include it in the main menu on the Drupal site. And many people don't notice that you're going over to a WordPress site, it's a separate domain there. But yeah, it fits nicely. And to get to the launch, the team kind of did do a little bit more kind of traditional WordPress theming, and did in some cases get away from the Timber approach of reusing the components. We'll talk about the impact of that in a bit. And then one other surprise, very close to our intended launch, we also learned that we were acquiring DEMAC Media in Toronto. And it was kind of known that this was going to be a little bit different in that, because of the timeline and also just the nature of the site in general, it was going to be a slightly different look and feel, but obviously still the same brand. But still having the design system really helped. So initial conversations, then when we got the developers together, we were able to say, we have this design system repository, you can have access to it, here's what's in it, here are the tools that are available to you, and you can just kind of use it as you see fit to help make this possible. And in this case, it was a more kind of selective use of things, picking and choosing classes, borrowing some markup. There were definitely some assets that they just used wholesale. But yeah, more of a picking and choosing kind of thing. But again, I think this helped them meet this tight timeline of matching the brand. So we made it. We made our November 5th, I think it was, launch date. And everyone took a nap. And then after that, we kind of roll into post-launch and the post-launch reality. So I rolled off of the day-to-day. Other devs came on to help out, Kyle and Steve in this case. And in this situation, now the majority of the enhancements that we're doing are really Drupal specific. So it's either bug fixes from the initial build or new functionality that didn't quite make scope, but all very Drupal specific things. And being introduced to the design system and the dependency there, kind of putting words in their mouth, but some of their reactions were like, why can't I just do the Drupal things? Why do I have to make these commits over here and pull that in? So some things we learned with new folks coming on is that documentation is important, and I think we did a decent job of documenting the workflow and how you manage this dependency. But what we didn't have was anything about the why. So I think it really would have helped if we explained, here's why we took this approach, the advantages that it gives, and some potential disadvantages. And having that up front, I think, would have helped rather than having this be a conversation when people get mad and have to make commits in places they don't expect. Another thing that thankfully I was able to get in place before new folks came on is it became very important to be able to have a good way to experiment in the context of Drupal. So being able to make changes, see what they look like in Drupal, rather than having to make changes in the design system, pull it down, see that it didn't quite meet your needs in Drupal, make changes again, and over and over and over. So nothing really fancy here, just a gulp tasks for a sibling checkout of the repository that copies stuff over, but did make it a lot easier to experiment, which I think helped a lot. And then also, especially as we took on some larger functionality and had some branches that were pretty different out there, we need to be strict about versioning when we were just kind of requiring it at head. We were in a situation where new design system functionality could be kind of leaking in. So we need to get much more stricter about versioning and pull in specific releases of the design system to prevent that. And kind of all of this gets at the fact that this approach does have some overhead. I think that the advantages that it brought us, especially getting the multiple properties together for launch, is worth the cost, but there is a cost, an ongoing cost. And then this is, in my eyes, kind of a good thing. But also the lines between the CMSES start to blur here. And Kristen, in QA testing new functionality, or John, the marketing head here, who has air quotes around marketing because he secretly gets his hand dirty in code sometimes, although not much of a secret now that I've said it repeatedly in this talk. So if we added like a hover state to one of these items, expect the changes to apply everywhere. It's working on the landing page on the Drupal site, but if it's not working on the training site, why is that? And part of that is because we took a little bit more of a traditional approach to make it to launch. So after the fact, we went back and refactored some of these things on the WordPress side to make sure that we're using as many of the literally same components as we could. Make it a little bit easier to pull in the design system into the WordPress project so that more often than not, the changes would just apply everywhere. So that's the traditional kind of CMS approach. So now let's talk a little bit about taking some of these concepts and trying to apply these to a progressively decoupled example. Specifically, looking at how this works when you have multiple templating engines at play. So the example that we're going to look at, it's a ongoing project, so we'll talk about it pretty high level. But progressively decoupled project, we have Drupal 8, and a portion of the Drupal 8 site is a pretty traditional Drupal 8 build. But it's also providing APIs that are going to be consumed by React. So default JSON API endpoints, but also complementing it with some custom JSON API endpoints as well. And then on the React side, that's consuming the Drupal APIs, and really what it's offering functionality-wise is an authenticated user portal. So we also have the portion of the site that's both Drupal and React, or the site as a whole, really. And that has traditional Drupal content, and then there's a set of like namespace roots that are owned by React for the user portal. So then kind of looking at this from a few different contexts, there's multiple developer contexts here. So the Drupal, there are Drupal developers who, again, are doing the more traditional Drupal 8 build, and they don't necessarily, aren't going to be working with React or as much with the React dependency. And then on the React side, our React devs want to be able to develop and test in isolation without spinning up a full Drupal VM. And they want to have their traditional workflow with hot module replacement and all of that stuff. And then obviously there's the real world combined context of the actual React portion of the site in Drupal. And testing that out is really important. So then looking at templating and styles, so Drupal uses Twig. There's going to be a set of unique components and styles on the Drupal side. React is using JSX. There's also going to be a set of unique components on the React side. But then in the middle, there are global styles that apply to both. A lot of it is things like typography, spacing scale, vertical rhythm, base HTML elements, that sort of stuff. There did not end up being a ton of like truly shared components. We were kind of wondering ongoing how that would shake out. There's a few things, but we really haven't found that it yet is worth the cost of trying to make it a truly shared component, but something that we're keeping an eye on. But even with just the global styles as an example, we're wondering, is there things that we can do taking kind of that design system approach that could help serve both elements of this project, specifically for those global styles. And as we were thinking about that, especially have to have our CSS and JS slide here. And also it's really interesting being here and seeing how people talk and think about CSS and JS versus a few weeks ago at Design for Drupal, seeing how people talk about CSS and JS there. Very interesting. But anyway, so looking at how we'll handle these styles, one thing that myself and other team members had heard a lot about was CSS modules. John Albin, who's also speaking at the same time right now, gave a great talk at DrupalCon going through CSS and JS options and kind of focusing in on CSS modules. Gatsby ships with it, support for it out of the box. So that's a way that I experimented with it before. Obviously there's other great resources out there. But we also kind of centered in on CSS modules. So for those, this audience I think is probably the most likely to have people who are already familiar with it, but just for folks who aren't, CSS modules is not like a package like something like styled components is. It's really something that's part of the traditionally Webpack build process. Another thing that it does is it scopes styles locally by default. We'll look at a quick example to kind of explain what that means. And it does let you write CSS in kind of like a more traditional way and plays nice with Sass as well. So you can still have CSS files or Sass partials that are just individual files. And it has that cool snarky logo where modules overflows the container. So talking about scope CSS, just a simple example from a little Gatsby side project about static sites and Drupal. We're just going to look at one of these cards as an example. So here is a module.css file. That module naming is, at least in Gatsby, what lets the Webpack loader pick up on this. The actual styles aren't super important here, but the general structure probably is. So there's the parent class of project card, and then we have inside of it title, language, description. And then if we look at the project card component, so first off, we're importing the module, project card module.scss as styles. And that gives us a styles object that we can use in our component and pass into the class name prop. So, obviously follows the general structure that we saw before. So there's the styles.projectCard for the top level parent, and then language, title, description, and all that stuff. And then what that gives us, if we actually look in the console here, is, for example, for the top level project card, there's the component name project card, module, then the name of the class project card, and then that kind of unique string that gets added to it. So that ensures really that this class is only going to apply in this particular context. The styles aren't going to leak elsewhere or be global. So depending on what you're looking to do, that can be useful or not. But the great thing about that is that you can also just import like a traditional Sass partial in this case, and have it handled globally. So here we just have the same styles in a projectcard.scss file. And we don't get the styles object. We can just use the class name prop and name our classes. All these styles are just available globally, like traditional CSS. So you can really have it both ways. So then, looking at how we use this in our initial approach, which implies that there was a revised approach, which we'll get to. So we had separate repositories for the project. So the design system was its own repo. And we had just a simple Gatsby site that showed these shared styles, what they look like. And then the different projects were able to just consume those partials as they needed. So on the React side, we're importing things in our JavaScript. And we're using a combination of that global and component scope that we looked at. So for the global styles and things like typography, we're importing that globally. But then at the level of like a button component, we would import the particular partial there and use that scoped styling. And there's also some project-specific CSS there as well. And then on the Drupal side, we have a build that just creates one large CSS file that has global styles from the design system and then Drupal-specific CSS as well. So exactly how we manage that dependency. So in this case, it's a npm dependency. And we just have a link to the Bitbucket repository in this case. So that allows us to npm install it. And then in, this is the Drupal example. So in one of our SAS files, we're importing, and the tilde for SAS loader lets you do a non-relative import. So one of the things that lets you do is have paths that are relative to your node modules folder. So that lets us grab the partials from the design system that we need, and then also we can import things from our Drupal theme as well, our components, all that good stuff. So just kind of combine everything together as we need it. And as I kind of implied, this was not really well received by the team as people got working with it. So managing the dependencies in this way it can be kind of tedious. So there are situations where oftentimes people would have to have multiple pull requests and multiple repositories, make sure they all land at the same time. But the bigger issue is that we found that people that were new to the project had trouble kind of understanding where they needed to make changes. And we could explain the process and what is where, but it definitely seemed like kind of an overall issue. And then another thing, one of the things that motivated us to have the React repository separately is that we wanted to make sure that our React devs could really easily do development in isolation without having to stand up Drupal. And even if everything was still in one place, there's nothing preventing us from doing that. You can still just, now that we've set up the project in such a way that it can live on its own, there's no reason you can't just run the React part and not worry about Drupal, even if it's in the same repository. And it's also, really just one progressively decoupled website at the end of the day. So we adjusted, and what we kind of evolved to, a single repository that has all these things. That is our progressively decoupled website project. But there is tooling that might be relevant to different developer contexts. So on the Drupal side, we have a Pattern Lab instance that has the shared styles rendered by Twig, and then Drupal-specific components. And then on the React side, we have a Storybook instance that has the React components. One thing that we looked at and tried to do was have, look if there's a way to have like Storybook, for example, or one place where we had all these components. I wasn't able to quite get it going with Storybook, but based on a talk yesterday and talking to some folks here, I think that's doable. But again, I wonder, I'll have to think about it, but there potentially also is an advantage to people having the tools that they're familiar with here. So there might still be a reason to have a Pattern Lab instance and a Storybook instance, but still figuring it out. But also, this kind of brings us, going back to our mustard, back in the Mayo must category, where everything lives together. So there really isn't going to be one single approach to how this would be divided up. So some lessons learned in going through that. I don't know that's really specific to this project, but the fact that the Drupal side of things and the React side of things are both using Webpack but have slightly different build processes, the quirks within that can be a pain. And then, talking about going from multiple repositories to a single repository, it's really just a set of trade-offs. And, depending on what you're trying to do, one approach might be better than the other. But really, having the multiple repositories can introduce some overhead, but gives you more control as far as when updates on the React side, for example, are pulled in and deployed on Drupal. One repository potentially simplifies that, but also we have seen it open some doors to regression. It's a little bit easier for changes in Drupal or changes in React to have like unintentional styling consequences, for example. And then also, you know, don't over-design your design system was kind of a lesson from this. And also, like, is this really even a design system? We were trying to take some of these concepts from other projects and apply it here. Is this really, in this case, because we came to the conclusion that we're really not going to be literally sharing components? Is this more like, you know, shared styles and related design tokens that we're using? Maybe it's a different thing. Maybe we're trying to just shove this into a design system shaped hole. And then some things that we're not doing yet, but have looked at. So we talked about the sharing components thing, and we really just haven't found that there's enough true overlap in components that it makes sense. We have seen some cases where there is the opportunity to share some JavaScript, but again, really haven't taken on the effort to share it. We've tried to write it in those cases in a more kind of vanilla JavaScript way so that it would be possible. But yeah, literally reusing components in this case would probably just require more JavaScript in some way. So more React on the Drupal side, or something like using web components that can be used in both places, which is another can of worms. And although we have things in a single repository now, we're not really using like a mono repo approach or something like Lerna to actually manage the dependencies within that one repo. We could do that to make things a little more formal, and that might help us get some of that control back and prevent some of those possible regressions. This is something that I'm sure folks around here have done and can probably help out with. Love to talk about it. But while we have like hot module replacement working in the React project when you're running it separately, we don't have that fully working in the context of Drupal yet. Have it close, but it eventually fails when there are changes. I'm sure that's a problem people have solved. And then we talked about the Storybook thing. We did look at trying to see if we could get Twig in Storybook, ran into some problems, but that, based on this conference, seems like a pretty solvable problem. But I'm still trying to figure out if it's something on this project that we want to solve. So yeah, as we kind of wrap up here, you know, question you might be wondering after seeing a couple of these examples, or even just, you know, these two, you know, if having a design system that's an external dependency would work for you or your project, and where you should put the mustard. You know, obviously, as you can tell, even just from these examples, that there really is no one answer obvious to that. It's going to depend on your project and a number of other factors. But the Lullabots site rebuild, for example, they went from a decoupled approach to a more traditional Drupal approach. They have a great blog post that goes into some of their rationale there, a podcast episode on it. But for them, I mean, they were specifically this time around trying to really take advantage of the wealth of Drupal experts that they have and keep things as kind of traditional core Drupal as possible. And in that case, especially if they don't think that they're going to use these components outside of the Lullabot site, probably doesn't make sense to have this as a separate dependency. Other things to consider here, you know, a lot of bullet points, but yeah, that same question, is there going to be value in reusing these components? The one thing, though, that I've experienced is that that might be hard to know for sure in the beginning. We didn't know that when we were doing our rebuild, and it ended up being very valuable. The role that prototyping plays in the project is worth considering. I do think that keeping a design system separate can help encourage prototyping. It also might make it easier to publish the design system independently if that's something you want to do. And then you also have to look at how this will align with your workflow and your team's makeup in general. Is it going to allow more people to contribute or not? And then potentially it might open the door to locking down the design system in some ways that might be useful. It will make it harder for somebody to make a bunch of willy-nilly changes that then just get applied on the project. And then another thing that has come up talking about doing this talk previously, also in general, there are a host of challenges to the component-based approach in Drupal in general. Things like caching and making sure you don't break things like quick edit or other integrations that Drupal depends on. That obviously is a whole different talk entirely, but also something to consider. But in general, one mustard does not fit all, and you'll really have to consider what works for your project and your team. But hopefully, going through this, you understand a little bit better what some of the advantages and disadvantages are in cases where it would apply. And again, in the case of the Bounty site, I'm really hoping that in addition to giving us some flexibility that lets us hit that launch date, it's going to let more people, more front-enders throughout our company to get hands-on with the site, which is hopefully a great thing. And that's it. Thank you. And if people have questions, I think we do have a little bit of time for questions. I don't want to keep people too far away from lunch, though. Yes?
So when you're doing the components like separate, repos and so on, I think one of the issues you run into is with styling. Sorry. How do you present, how did you guys resolve the problem? Was that a problem that you couldn't present the components in isolation while it's still showing a relative useful theme to what you're working on, right? So the idea of having components separately, React components say in your storybook,
yep.
And then you import them in, right? That's great, but how do you then make sure that that library is showing properly what your website should look like without duplicating code and all that stuff? So
yeah.
The styling part.
So is the question mostly about the actual real world context of the combined React and Drupal site?
Right, sort of like that, right? So if I'm working on the component level and I want to look at it and see, here are how these components are available for me to use in Drupal.
Yep.
But how do you make sure those components are actually looking like what they would look like in Drupal as far as their theming and design? Because there's things you're overriding in Drupal that actually makes your website.
Yep.
Whereas a component, you're just creating components that could be themed for anything. But
yep.
In this particular case, you really just, it's not an open source project, it's your own website.
Yep.
So there's no point in showing out of theme components. They're not relevant to this project itself. So is that a problem or resolved?
Yeah, I mean, that definitely is something that is basically a reality of this approach. I haven't personally had it be much of an issue. Oftentimes these are, so while we did in one of these cases have a design system that we could use in a couple of different contexts, it was still for this really strong brand. And then also on the Drupal side, there are things that you can do to try to make sure that there are less things outside of your theme or design system that are going to interact with it. So starting from a real clean base theme, you can even, there are cases where you can override and remove some styles. So I haven't had it be that huge of a problem, but you're right that it is very important to literally see what it actually looks like within the context of the Drupal site.
So to clarify then, so your components by themselves were not themed, they were just...
They were themed, yeah.
They were themed to the final, as close to the final version as you wanted to?
Yes,
okay.
Yep. Yep,
so
yeah.
Your styles were, a lot of them were done at the component level and brought in and used that way.
That's right. Yeah, that might not have been clear from this, but for example, for the Drupal site, there actually was not a lot of additional Drupal-specific styling in the theme.
Great. Okay.
Yeah. Cool. Cool. Any other questions? Yes.
Last thing, since you're using CSS modules, it looks like you were using CSS and JS for some of your initial components, or not?
As far when you say CSS and JS, are you saying still actually importing the styles, or something like style components?
How are you doing styles in this?
Yep. So on the React side, it's a combination. So some of the global things are just being imported globally in the JavaScript. But then at the component level, it's scoped to the component and imported in the component. So for something even like a button, even though we have generic button styles, in the button component, they're still importing the specific button styles. And then for something that's specific to the React side of things, there's its own partial that lives in the React repo, and then that gets imported.
One of the biggest issues we've had is sort of being able to also have a style system that is consumable by anything, right? So it's a
Yep.
really, really hard thing. Oh, we built a thing, it's in Twig. Okay, a client wants to consume, at least some of those rules in something else, right? And so we're like, well, we kind of built it in React, it's all in CSS modules.
Yep.
So, sort of one of the things we've fallen back to is like, what if we go all the way back? And we've been looking into Tailwind a lot, which is does massively generated utility classes, and then now we have like a super shared system of utility classes. So React uses it, Twig uses it, and it becomes a nice external thing. It's totally technology agnostic at that point. This is kind of like one of the ways we handle that. And we're like, yeah, and it's kind of fun to use in React. It works great in Twig. And everything else.
In doing that, have you found that you use Tailwind alongside some of these approaches, or that essentially becomes the way you stop
It is
things?
the CSS, yes, the way
Okay.
we're doing it. And we can do things like, you can use things like purge CSS to kind of look, remove all the unused cruft at that point, so you get this extra tuning on top of it. So.
Cool, interesting.
Having a single repo, did you run into, like, can you imagine the issue, because you're not using mono repo to learn it right now, so like,
Yeah.
how do you manage the quality of the code or the standards of the code when you have completely different systems there, like React and so on? So like, what does the PR review kind of process looks like when you have so many different disciplines there?
Yeah, the question was how we handle reviews when we have everything in one repository. Yeah, valid concern. We happen to have enough folks that are kind of able to review at a high level and understand things with the context of both React and Drupal. So I think we just have the right team makeup for that.
Okay.
But if we didn't, that could potentially be a problem.
Okay.
Yes.
For both the projects, are people always designing in the design system and then implementing on the websites? Or do you have, like when you're onboarding people, do some people start in other patterns, or is that, I guess,
Yeah. So this approach is definitely tends to focus on building components in isolation first and then applying them. But when we talked about, after the launch of our site, when people were dealing with like more Drupal specific things, and the card was, fix this thing in Drupal. For them, it's a little bit less about that. So it was important that we had a way that they could experiment on the Drupal side of things. But yeah, I would say that.
were they building, sorry. Well, I mean, in that case, were they essentially doing group development and then saying like, oh yeah, now I have to update? I'm asking because this is basically what I end up doing.
Yeah.
Then you're like, all right, well, I guess I have to update this stuff, right, too.
Yeah, and it is basically that, and that there's potentially some frustration with that. Like, I just want to make things look right in Drupal. Why do I then have to go update the design system? But because the design system is a separate dependency, and we're literally using those same templates, you're just making the change in one place. You're making the change in the design system that then Drupal and WordPress are using. So you don't have to like make the change in two places, but you're potentially trying to make a change in Drupal, and to do that, you have to go to this separate repository and update that there.
Yeah, so in some of the cases, I guess it's not too much, but like, if it's a markup thing, like, oh, this needs to be reordered, or it needs to
Yep.
have some class or something, it's like, yes, the templates are the same, but like, we have it where it's loading the templates in, and so like, I'm modifying the templates in Pattern Lab, but I'm looking at the Drupal website to see
Yeah.
how they're rendered.
Yeah.
Then I'm like, oh yeah, then I have to change all the data model if I'm changing variable names in Pattern Lab, because now that's gotten updated. So I was just curious if people are doing, if the developers you mentioned end up doing that, or if, because that's what's easier for them, or if people have all kind of onboarded to like, no, we need to really just like do it all in the pattern, in the design system, and then figure out how it flows through the other stuff.
Yeah, that's a little tough to answer. I would say that my experience was that in the initial build, it was everything in the design system first. And then I believe that as people have been dealing with more Drupal-specific stuff, it's probably a little bit on the other side of the coin there. Cool. Anything else? Yes?
I just have kind of a philosophical question. So if you guys, Brian, if you guys were to do another redesign next year, how would you do it? Would you go back to the kind of pure Drupal, or would you take this next step in this approach?
Yeah. So am I answering that question specifically from like our site? Like if we were to rebrand
however
it?
you want to do it.
Yeah. I think for us it still makes sense for it to be a separate dependency. There are some cases where beyond the Drupal website, for example, we're using this. So from that perspective, I think it makes sense. It also is a pretty clean approach from like a component-based approach, and really developing your components in isolation have some advantages there. If it was something like instead, like a small microsite that we were doing related to our brand, if we could reuse some of these things, we'd probably also use the design system. But if it was literally just a completely different look and feel, totally new thing, we know it's temporary, not going to be used again, then I don't know that this approach would make sense, and we might just do more traditional Drupal build. Does that kind of help?
Yeah.